Hello and welcome to the Content 10X podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and I'm delighted to be here with you today. And yet again, I am joined by our fantastic co-host, Hayley Evans. So Hayley, welcome. How are you today?
I'm so good, Amy. Thanks again for having me. It's been fun. So I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, this series is going really, really well. So we are currently running a series on the Content 10X podcast all about expert interviews. So all about how you can create so much awesome content from interviewing the experts in your organization. We believe in B2B marketing in particular, that it is so important to create, really undifferentiated thought leadership content. And we're so passionate that expert interviews are a way that you can do that we decided to embark upon this series that we're running. So first episode in the series, Hayley and I spoke all about the concept of expert interviews and how powerful they can be, what they are, the who, what, why, how in a bit of an overview. And then we have an episode which is all about the actual preparation. So we think it's so important that you do lots and lots of preparation for the expert interviews. So we have talked through that in our last episode. And then in this episode, we're running into the actual how. So how do you run the expert interviews? Now, just wanted to mention, our passion for expert interviews comes from the fact that we really do believe that you need to be creating authentic content. In this world of AI generated content, there's so much content out there that is being created by AI. But we don't want to create content that competes with AI, because from our perspective, if AI can create that content, then it's been said before. It's not going to be unique. It's not going to be undifferentiated. We want to create that type of content. That's what's so important in B2B. And that sits with the experts in your organization. I did an entire episode 323, go check that out, called How to Create Content That AI Can't Create, where we talked about expert interviews. And I'd really encourage you to listen to episode with Andy Crestadina as well, because we talk there about this world of AI generated content and how we differentiate and how we create different content. And we discussed leaning into the unique expertise and, the authentic voices and human led content that is so, so important. So this is why we've decided to embark on the series, Hayley, isn't it? Because we're just very passionate that this is one of many, but a very powerful way that you can create really great thought leadership, undifferentiated, unique, nurturing content for your audience.
We're so passionate about it. And, I think everybody's saying the rise of AI driven content. It's so telling out there. And nobody wants to connect with a robot. There's no nurturing, there's no authenticity, there's no trust that's been built. When you're connecting with your audience, if your audience's first message through their content is it's been written by an AI, then your audience first thought is going to be, okay, am I going to interact with them? Am I going to bother with this business? Or what, if they haven't kind of gone to the effort of creating this authentic content that's meaningful and personal and individual and thought leadership for me, am I going to get past the next piece of content? And Amy, I know there's that 7 piece of content threshold that it takes for a customer to really become a customer. And this is where we're really passionate about creating content that's differentiated from AI. And when you're looking at the stats and, the estimation of 90 to 95% of content being AI written over the next 2 years, there is a huge opportunity if you're the company that's kind of aligned with our core values, that you are actually going to be in a great position to be seen differently against the massive AI content. So it's a brilliant opportunity right now where some people are going heavy in AI. We are so passionate about the authenticity, the nurturing, the thought leadership that's completely opposite, which is why we've done this 5-part series of expert interviews to give you opportunities to do expert interviews that are completely different AI.
Yeah. And, and we acknowledge that they're not the easiest thing to do and that they take a lot of hard work, but the hard work is worth it, which is why we've broken it down into this series. Mm-hmm. So do go check out the episode before this if you haven't already, because we ran through in that episode in 325 about how to actually prepare. So an entire episode on preparation, because that's how important we think it is. And we covered in that episode things like preparing the questions that you are going to ask, and obviously the who's. Who are you going to be speaking to? Who is going to be doing the interviewing? Are you going to have a facilitator and questions like that? And we talked about the preparation as well from a tech perspective. So as well as understanding your content strategy, and then who are you going to interview and how are you going to interview and what you're going to ask them, you also need to be prepared for the tech side of things and putting people at ease. So we've done all of that prep. Let's assume that people who are tuning in now and listening to what we have to say, Hayley, they've done that prep and they're now facing the recording. Where do we start? So what should we dig? I've just mentioned tech, but usually that is a big thing, isn't it? So how do you go through that? How do you make sure that you're going to get the content that you want technically from that kind of setup?
Yeah, I mean, tech is the first thing that we do. So, you've got the interview preparation, you've planned everything out, but when it actually comes to the interview itself, the first thing that we do is tech check. So, if you haven't grabbed it yet, we have an impactful interview guide where we've got all of these prep guidelines. So if you pop onto content10x.com/interview-guide, you can grab your copy as well. But the most important thing that we recommend with any tech check is try not to do it on the day of recording. Yeah. We've said this before in our previous episode. Try and do a pre-interview test. Make sure that your mic is running correctly, that the audio quality is good. You can do a good test on that to make sure, because sometimes what you hear on screen comes out differently on a recording. And the same with the video quality, internet speeds, etc. Literally anything that you can do that's technical related as a test beforehand is so important, because as I mentioned in the previous episode as well, tech issues are the biggest thing that can throw people off. You don't want your team member is probably already nervous about being on screen. It might be their first time. And so we don't want to double down on the nervousness by having tech issues that throw them off and then they get flustered beforehand. So it's really important that, the key thing is headphones and mic first. Audio quality is hugely important, and especially if you're just doing an audio only episode as well. So very, very important to test those for. And then again, just checking as well if you're using external camera. So for example, some people might be running a desktop that doesn't actually have a camera that they assumed did. So again, it's always worth checking all of those bits, but don't forget as well the other bits of, your background. What do you want it to be presentable? We have kind of had issues in the past which have been resolvable, where a Zoom background is flipped the wrong way around. So the company logo is the opposite way around. So there's, bits that we can kind of edit in post, as we'd say, but it's just worth just triple checking, have you got anything in your background that actually doesn't look presentable? Or, has your company got a Zoom background or a recording background screen that could be presentable? Just keep in mind, again, though, the repurposing elements of it. So is that logo going to be cut off halfway through? Actually, would it be better to just kind of have a simple screen? All of those little elements that we definitely consider when we're facilitating it. But I think bottom line, though, the one thing that we would recommend, though, is that if in that first kind of 5-10 minutes that you're realizing that those tech issues aren't solvable, don't go ahead with the recording. This is really crucial, important content that you want to get out. And yes, whilst it kind of takes its time to do, the benefits of, repurposing that content, for example, even some of these expert interviews can potentially overlap in evergreen content. It's so important that you actually just hit pause and reschedule it and do it when everything's kind of ready to go, and do it as professional as possible, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that sometimes when it's been really hard to pin people down with busy schedules and things like that, and you're really respectful of the time of the person who you're about to interview, they're an expert in something and they're giving up time from their busy day. And then there is some sort of like little tech niggle. I've been there before where there's the temptation to think it's not that bad. Like your audio's not maybe perfect, but it's okay. Or, there is a bit of a delay, but you just kind of think, oh, but we should just proceed anyway, because it was so hard to pin this time down and this, that, and the other. And it's just the worst decision really, because then you just waste people's time, because you've done all this planning to get all this content from it. And then you sat there thinking, well, we'll only be able to turn this into written content, but we can't use the audio or video because of this or that. And then what a shame that is. So yeah, don't hesitate to be bold if there are any issues. The other thing I was going to mention, just before we then move on to the actual interview itself beyond tech checks, is you made a really good point, Hayley, that sometimes if it's somebody who hasn't done anything like this before, maybe been like interviewed on camera, especially video as well as audio, you're just kind of doubly checking with them that everything's set up. But I've found as well that sometimes it's the more seasoned people who've done it a million times, have their own podcast, or those kinds of things, because we've all been there, me included, where you can get really blasé then because you know the ropes, and you don't want to be patronizing in saying to a person who actually has a podcast themselves and things like that, are you sure that you have enabled the right mic? But actually, as I said, I've been there before. I've done hundreds of podcast episodes, and I can be the one that forgets to enable the right mic and things like that. So it's not, it's sometimes the more seasoned ones that you're all guilty of being a bit blasé about these things, and you don't check your things properly. So check everyone and all of that. And then another key thing is, we talked about this in the last episode, but is there a facilitator who's going to be doing the interview? Is there an interviewer and a facilitator, or just the facilitator doing it? And thinking about what you agreed in your preparation phase. So when you were doing all the planning and working out the questions and the content, are they going to be in the content, or is any question or point or anything raised by the interviewer or the facilitator going to be completely edited out of the content? So they're really just extracting that content, and that will be edited out, because that plays a big role as well, doesn't it, Hayley, from how the interviews actually ran. And I'll let you move on to that really now. So we passed the tech checks and we're underway. How in your experience, because you've done this so many times, how do you then facilitate that great interview then?
There's so many ways that we do. And I think the first step that I certainly do as a facilitator is just reminding people, first of all, that, the interview's coming up. So whilst we've done the tech check, so for example, I might have done a pre-interview test, a day or two before, we all know that actually we sometimes forgetful on the actual day. So it's just reminding people, if, for example, like Amy and I, and you're using AirPods, are they charged? Are they ready? You haven't been out for a run and kind of depleted your battery and you're not ready for it. So it's just reminding them just ahead of the call, quick pop, you'd like anything that needs to be charged, let's just charge it, and read through the kind of questions beforehand, just to kind of familiarize yourself with it. Again, we've said before, you don't want to be reading off the script. But my role really comes in from the moment that we're on the call. And so as a facilitator, it's really setting the scene. So just reminding everybody, so whether I'm actually just interviewing one person or facilitating somebody else interviewing someone else, which I do as well, it's really for me as an opportunity to just remind people, a brief overview of the purpose. So, on the second episode that we've done on this, what was the plan behind this? What's the purpose? What kind of points do you want to hit? What's the vibe and the tone of the interview? What elements are we trying to kind of portray across to our audience? Just really kind of setting the scene as a reminder. So we have the serious conversation at the beginning, but then the most important thing is that I make that expert, both either just the expert or the person who's also interviewing. Again, don't assume that the interviewer is going to be relaxed and ease. They could be nervous, but it's really just making sure that everybody is relaxed as possible. They know that we can edit, we can record again. When we do mess ups, it's absolutely fine. The most important thing is to just stop, take a breath, not get flustered, know that it can be edited out, and then go again. But we really value that rapport building. So there's nothing more important than me than a 5-10 minute warm up before we hit record. So do make sure. So for example, if you're recording and you're aiming to do a half an hour recording, set an interview for 45 minutes so that you have a 10-minute pre-interview rapport, tech checks, and a 5-minute kind of, review of how that interview went. I find it that it's kind of like anything. If you're going for a run, for example, is the best one. You're not going to run out the front door. You're going to do a little bit of a warm up and kind of get into the rhythm of things before you're then going to start sprinting. And this is the same with our expert interviews. We want to create that warm up, that really warm vibe, because people connect to people, and people can kind of connect to that warmth as well. So we want to make sure that that's all within it. And then as well, for me, I also turn up 5 or 10 minutes before anybody's even on the call. So that's another important part for my role, is again testing everything's working. So whatever platform that we're recording on, is anything wrong with that? Have I made sure that the settings are right to actually record it? So some elements we want to make sure that we're not recording to a cloud, we're recording to a desktop, we're recording in the right quality that we want to. So it's all of those elements that we want to really be considering ahead. And again, it's reminding people of key tips. So this is one thing that we kind of get a lot with people who haven't particularly been doing this very often, that it's really a reminder that it's not like a normal conversation where you might interrupt somebody and you might get really excited. When we're doing these expert interviews, it's so important to pause before answering a question and pause before starting the next question, because sometimes an expert might have hit their points, but they're thinking of something else. So give them a chance to get all of their information across and close and end that question before you then move on to the next ones. Those pauses can be edited out so it becomes very, very smooth, but then it's not jarring for somebody who's listening to it to hear those overlapping voices as well. And we mentioned before, we've had previous issues where somebody's video's glared when they've moved away from the camera. So again, it's my point to just remind people that if it glares or glitches, just notice and kind of pause and then come back to it. As a facilitator, I help really to encourage kind of sticking to the storytelling, but whilst maintaining the engagement, and making sure I kind of, lead them to the interview when we're kind of rolling, but drop in when I can see anybody that's kind of getting flustered or off point, just so that we can kind of get the most engaging content out of it at the end of the day.
And it all comes back to the content, doesn't it? And just bearing that in mind. And I guess as you were speaking then, I was just thinking how if we just refer back to the preparation. So if you know from this interview, the certain stories that you're hoping are going to make a good image carousel, like we were saying, and then the really key sound bites that you want to get from this expert, you want to ask those questions because they're going to become the short vertical videos for LinkedIn or TikTok, Instagram, etc. When you're whether you're working facilitator or not, or you're just running the interview, it's so important to have on that preparation sheet a reminder of that content that you hope to glean from that question, isn't it? Because I'm just thinking to myself that it's probably worth then asking them to answer it in a particular way. If the facilitator or the interviewer isn't in the content, that would obviously be, if it was going to become a full podcast episode, you wouldn't be giving them guidance along the way, although anything can be edited. But I'm just thinking sometimes you probably ask the question, but would say to them, could you do me a favor by answering this question by first just repeating the question? So just start by saying, if you're asking an expert, how do you, they're a social media expert, how do you stand out on Instagram? You could just say to them, could you just answer it by just saying, yeah, so how do I stand out on Instagram? Well, and then answer the question, because that's gonna be the great. So it's all about, if you hadn't done the prep, you won't be thinking about these things. But in the preparation, you can sometimes say, could you just start by just mentioning the question I asked you and then ease into your answer and things like that. So there's a lot of work that can be done to make sure that the most content gets out. And of course, I guess you're also checking, Hayley, aren't you, that it doesn't sound like anyone's reading off script. You've already talked about this, but making sure that everyone is at ease is a key thing. And those stories come out.
Yeah. I think that's exactly it, Amy, is it's a story. Whilst we talk hugely about the kind of planning aspect of it, at the end of the day, it is a story that you're telling, so make room for it. Don't be really rigid in the content. So, whilst you want to hit those right notes, you don't want it to be a script. You don't want it to kind of feel very kind of restrained and formal. And I think when you have somebody like a facilitator or myself involved with it, that's where there's a relaxed nature to it, that it's very easy to get forgetful in a high pressured environment when you're being recorded and you're thinking, I've got to say these questions and answer these notes, that actually something might get missed. But having a facilitator means that, when I'm running an interview, I just note down all of those points that have been hit and haven't. And then this is where, I'll be in the background writing notes quietly in the back, so that there might be a point that we might not have covered on that pre-interview questionnaire that I actually find is really interesting. And quite often I will ask them to kind of go further into it in the recording, or confirm something that didn't make sense, or I might have spotted something that is going to be great for social that we might not have considered. And exactly like Amy that you said, I'll be asking them to go back and, maybe getting the interviewer to ask it in a different way, maybe getting the expert interviewee to respond to it in a different way. But it's really important to create space for these unexpected insights. So whilst you've planned everything down to a T, let the interview flow, let that content come out, and allow for that space. So we said it before, make sure that any new questions though do remain open-ended. So you don't want yes and no answers. You want this to be a great conversational flow. But also don't forget the opening and closing sections. We quite often have been on expert interviews where we just go straight in, and it's kind of, let's remind the audience of what they're about to listen to, and what the opening is. And multiple times we've recorded the kind of closing again and again to make sure that not only are we getting the right call to action, but we're getting differentiated call to actions. So this, for example, is especially important if you are doing evergreen content. You might have a certain call to action that you're using at the moment, but actually in 6 months' time, you might want to switch out different call to actions. So it's really important. Or for example, if you're using your expert interviews as a podcast, you might have some mid-roll that you want to put in, which again, you can record within this expert interview too. So just really, really think about those and just allow that time and space to record the additional content that you might need. As we've said before, this is so important because everybody's time on these calls and recordings are so valuable that we would always recommend to schedule, 15 minutes more so that you're getting as much content with these key people in the right kind of atmosphere and frame of mind when you've got them, than trying to kind of re-record at a later date. And then at the end, we always do this amazing immediate follow-up, which is lovely. So, how they found it. Quite often that you'll find the people that you're interviewing have never done it before. It might have been something that they completely didn't expect. But for feedback for us, for our clients, we can tell them if, the person enjoyed being interviewed. And this is quite nice when you're a facilitator because you have a really kind of impartial view that the person who's being interviewing can be honest with you about kind of how they found it. And quite often, more than not, it's an exciting part of their role that they've not been able to do, and, share those kind of key insights. And then we really emphasize about just doing it straight away because the feedback is there, and then you can then share it with the rest of the team, then kind of going back on a call because people just might forget as well. As I said, it's a high pressure environment when you're hitting record, than doing it later on, isn't it, Amy?
I completely agree with you. And I was going to say as well that if you're not working with a facilitator and it's yourself running the content, and it is more of a sort of single run through. So perhaps you are just doing it to run straight through to be a podcast episode or a video or anything like that. So you don't have the luxury in a way of being able to ask people to reframe it again or give people feedback and stuff. What Hayley said about asking open-ended questions and being prepared for some unexpected segues and insights, I guess is even more important really, isn't it, Hayley? Because if you're going to ask certain questions, if you've got a facilitator and you've got a bit of time and you're going to be pulling out the best content in different places, so you get the opportunity to follow up on that answer that was a bit short and ask for more elaboration. But if you don't have that luxury, you don't have anybody there facilitating and you're doing a single run through, it's just being open-ended and having those planned follow-up questions, isn't it? And you only get better with time, it's like any skill at all. The more that you do expert interviews, so the more that you run them, the better that you will get, the more experience you'll get, the more you'll be able to flow with people who, to what you thought was an open-ended question, to a shorter answer. You learn as you go, don't you, basically?
You really, really do. And the one thing that I would also suggest as well is if you're facilitating the expert interview and you think of another question that hasn't been answered, provide the team points that you want them to cover. You might have been thinking about it in the background, but don't forget they have been focused on this interview. So they won't really know what kind of points that you might want them to hit. So if you've got an idea of a question that might not have been answered and key points, make sure that you're sharing that with them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And while she was talking, I've thought of one other little tip that I have, which is you were mentioning about being really respectful of time, making the most of the time and things like that. And you were also talking about intros and mid-rolls. Little tip I have as well is that there's been some times where I've been interviewed on people's podcasts and webinars and things like that. They've used the time with me that they booked in with me to record like their intros and things like that. So, I've kind of been sat there as the guest and they've just sort of said, just give me 5 minutes or so. I'm just going to do the intro. And, I'll sit there while they're saying, welcome to this podcast. We're going to be speaking to Amy Woods about, or sometimes they'll do it at the end and they'll reflect on what we just spoke about. And I've sometimes thought to myself, it's a bit of a shame really, because I'm kind of sat here watching them do an intro or a close or a mid-roll. They could have asked me another question and done that when I'm not there, because I didn't play any part in the intro or the close. So yeah, and it's it's each to their own and things like that. But if you've got this valuable time, and then it is going to go on and become a YouTube video or a podcast and things like that, and you're going to do a introduction where you're going to cover the key points of what you're about to hear on this episode, you don't really need them there, do you? That could be another great LinkedIn video. That 2 minutes could have been something else. And so thinking about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Using your expert's time to the best of the advantage. And so, when I'm saying before about putting an extra 15 minutes in for the intro and the ending, don't forget to put that extra time in for yourself to do it separately. And, as Amy mentioned, those intros, those out rolls, mid rolls that you could be doing on your own, but also the time just after the interview that you've done. You need some time to kind of digest it and also write down your initial thoughts. Were there any key moments that you thought were specific for social? Write those parts down straight away. Don't book yourself on a call 5 minutes after you've recorded this.
No, so fresh in your head. It's such a great opportunity, isn't it, to just put that time aside. I completely agree. And then another final thing I was going to mention there as well is that, Hayley, you mentioned about when you're doing the planning and the prep and coming up with questions, quite often within organisations, you'll know that there'll be potentially a legal review of this content before it goes out. Certainly with some sectors that we work with, that's always important, and my PR team might review it as well. So it's good, isn't it, to maybe slim down that review process to immediately ask the expert if off the top of their head they realise they maybe went off on a slight tangent or said something that they realise actually probably just needs to be edited out because legal might have a bit of an issue with that and things like that, or somebody might, or they just regret it. We sometimes say things and then think, oh gosh, probably shouldn't have said that because we've not quite signed off on that yet or something like that. It's always good, isn't it? Because if you can just whip out something that wasn't that value add anyway, so it really doesn't matter if we take it out, but that's the difference between a 2-hour legal review or a week of them working out whether they're going to allow it or not.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's hugely important. For example, we have a client that legally can't say, I think it's you have to say real estate agent, not realtor, because that's a huge legal flag if we say realtor. And, it's reminding the team at the beginning, again, of those legal points that we must not hit. For audio, it's slightly different because if you make a mistake, we can edit in the audio. So, for example, if they said realtor, we can edit in when they said real estate agent beforehand. So there's elements, but also, it's important to, at the end of that interview, if there's any kind of bits that they fumbled or they feel that that they shouldn't have said or that they know aren't going to go past legal, to just having that kind of debrief time to just write those points down. That's hugely important. And yeah, there's nothing like a long legal review that's frustrating for somebody when you're sat on great content that you want to get out. Let's try and get out as quickly as possible.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, brilliant. I mean, that was such a great conversation. I think we've really gone through lots of tips and advice there on how to actually run these expert interviews. There's so much preparation. And I think it came to light in this episode of our series that the preparation was so important because it lent right into the actual running of the episode. So whether you have a facilitator or you're doing the interviews yourself, prep's important, and then actually how you run it is so key to actually making the most of it. And that leads on to our next episode. So the next episode is going to be about what do we do then? We're sitting on this absolute content gold, all this like unique, undifferentiated, human-led thought leadership content from experts in our organisation. What are we going to do with it? We've planned it, but let's just talk through what that planning could have looked like and what we're going to create. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode. We mentioned it a few times, but do make sure to get a copy of our impactful interview guide. If you're listening to this as a podcast episode, you can just go down and click the link in the show notes in whatever app you're in. Otherwise, you can head to content10x.com/interview-guide or go to the resources section on the content10x.com website. You'll be sure to see it. So our impactful interview guide, it's helping you with most of what we've been talking about in this series, getting that preparation checklist, tips on how to deliver messages powerfully when you are being interviewed as an expert, and a run through of those tech checks and things like that you need to do. So go check that guide out. Then, as I mentioned, the next part of the series, how do you repurpose, how do you distribute, how do you maximize the content from these awesome expert interviews? And here's a quick clip from the next episode. The fun begins. So Hayley, where do we start? Like, there's so much you can create.
If you've planned everything, you realistically know what you're going to be repurposing into, but do think broadly of that content that you can repurpose in, and don't just think of social assets. It's across every single platform.
Repurposing can go in different directions too, breaking big pieces down into smaller pieces and picking out the key angles and the key stories and the key points, things like that. But it can also be brought up too. If you've planned over the course of 6 months or a year or whatever to interview certain experts to cover very particular topics, and the whole strategy there was that those topics were ultimately all going to feed into a big end of year report, or an industry report, or an ebook or something like that, a white paper that you're creating, then actually that's going in the other direction. That's taking something long form and turn it into longer form. Hope you enjoyed that, and we are very much looking forward to the next episode on the podcast. We are going to also do an FAQ episode at the end of this series too. So if you've got any questions about running expert interviews at all, from the prep to the how to the repurposing, anything at all, then just send that question over to info@content10x.com, and we'll be able to look into including that in our roundup FAQ episode of this special series that we've been doing. Hayley, I think that's a wrap, isn't it? I think that was everything that we wanted to cover in this episode.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're looking forward to the next one.
Me too. Great. All right. Well, all that's left to say is thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we will catch you in the next one.